Bonjour tout le monde, bon après-midi. Merci d'être ici avec nous. Je m'appelle Antoine Bilodeau, je suis professeur au département de sciences politiques ici à l'Université Concordia et aussi membre du CECD, basé à l'Université de Montréal. It's really great to have you with us today, especially, I mean, because you're here, because we have a great event, but also because we are inaugurating our new format of our speaker series. For what, now, 15 years almost, the CSDC has had a speaker series, and we've always had individual single speaker at a time. And this year we try a new format where we have 3 speakers at a time, but fewer events. So that's the first of 3 we are having this year. So we're really glad to see us to see you with us today. We have 3 great speakers who are going to talk on the broad topic of second-generation immigrant, children of immigrants from different disciplines. I will introduce them one at a time where the time comes. The format for today is each speaker has been allocated 50 minutes. So they have about 50 minutes to make their presentation of about 25 minutes. After that, there will be a Q&A of about 25 minutes, and then you'll have a 10-minute breaks to just refresh yourself in between each speaker. So our first speaker today is Karen Phalet, who's professor of social and cultural psychology and chair of the personality and social research and methodology unit at the Faculty of Psychology and Educational Sciences at the University of Leuven in Belgium. That's a long title. And that's just beginning of the bio, though. So recent collaborative and interdisciplinary research projects of Karen covers migration-related topics at the nexus of ethnic diversity with exclusions or inequalities, such as generational change and mobility in migrant families, second-generation identities in European cities, religion and civic integration, and inter-ethnic conflict, prejudice, and discrimination. So you're very busy and, you know, very in-depth, engaged scholars. So she's been involved in several major national and cross-national data infrastructure initiatives in European migration studies, publishes in disciplinary social psychology and sociology journals, and interdisciplinary ethnic and migration studies journals. And that's it. So you can see we're very privileged to have Karen with us today. So I will stop speaking because you're not here to listen to me. So Karen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antoine, for your kind words. And thank you all for inviting me and for this opportunity to get some comments, I hope, or some insights on the work we're doing in Belgium. I will start from a puzzle, which we call the integration paradox. And from there, I will give some snapshots of things that we have been researching. And most of my research has been from the perspective of Muslim youth in Europe, mostly second-generation youth, but also some new studies with newcomers, refugees. I'll start right away. Yeah. So since I'm used to being the only psychologist on interdisciplinary occasions like this, I have a slide with my approach, which I call a social cultural psychology approach of intercultural relations. And I'll start on the right-hand side with the personal level. So we're interested in the experiences of minoritized persons. And we've been looking into these experiences in a dynamic way by focusing on individual trajectories of contact experiences and engagement with different cultures. So that's the personal level. Then there's like the meso level, where we're interested in norms in the broad sense of the term, so mostly descriptive norms. It's situated and emergent in particular groups, for instance, peer groups or communities, in relationships or in networks. So that's a meso level of intersubjectivity, where intercultural relations are negotiated. And then lastly, there's the context around it. And we look at that context in terms of the affordances and constraints, in terms of how the context constitutes intercultural relations. So context is everything. It's institutional arrangements. It can be stratification, segregation, the more structural features of how society organizes these intercultural relations, but it can also be public opinion climate. So what we focus on here are ideologies or more the climate or the policies that that constitute or define intercultural relations at the broader social cultural level. So I'll go from, I'll start now at the right-hand side, putting some flesh on the bones. So I start with the personal experiences. And that's my entry into the so-called integration paradox. I don't know if you use the term here, if it's, there's a recent review by Schafer and Kass of 42 studies showing that, so what the paradox is about is that on average, those immigrants and especially children of immigrants who are most well integrated in terms of attainment and acculturation tend to feel less included, less belonging, to be more critical, to experience more exclusion. So this is called this kind of disaffection among well-integrated, highly integrated, minoritized persons is called the integration paradox, right? Is that something that is familiar? Yeah, okay. So starting from the perspectives or the experiences of Muslim minoritized youth, most of my research over the 2 decades or more has been with these populations. I'll translate. This is a quote from Qualitative Interviews, which summarizes this paradox from the perspective of how Esra, a Turkish-German young adult, experiences intercultural relations. She says, I think that I belong totally here in Germany, and Germany is really my home. I feel better here than in Turkey, but I know that by the real Germans, I'm still seen as a foreigner. And this is because I look differently, I have a different name. And then she says, regardless of how much I'm integrated or I am already German, in the eyes of the Germans, I remain only Turkish. So that's a quote that I think captures nicely what this paradox is about. So going from qualitative to some quantitative findings, how do we look at this paradox or this disconnection between individual acculturation and attainment on the one hand, and a sense of belonging or inclusion in society on the other hand? What you see here is from the SILS data, where we have the 4 SILS countries, Germany, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Britain, and then Belgium added. And this is just very roughly showing you the levels of national belonging. So we ask people how strongly they feel that they belong or are connected to the people in the country where they live. And what you see, the gray bar, it's a kind of reference population, which does not have a migration background. And then we aggregate, very roughly, those youngsters, 14, 15 years old, who self-identify as Muslim with a migration background, and then those with a migration background who do not self-identify as Muslim. And you see that across the countries, there's a significant gap in belonging, as you would find in most countries. I don't know about Canada, between the non-immigrant and the immigrant origin population at this young age. But then in all countries on the continent, not England, you see that there's an additional gap, so that the self-identified Muslims are even experience less belonging than other kids with a migration background. So that's a quite general finding. Then when we try to explain these gaps, so this is an example from Germany, where we look at the gap. So the reference group is the non-Muslim 4th generation plus, so non-migrant, non-Muslim kids. And then compared to those kids, you see that the Muslim and the non-Muslim kids experience less belonging. And what you see in green, it's the gross gap, and it's split by migration generation, so that you can see that, especially for the Muslims, also in the 2nd and 3rd generation, there is this gap. So it's not a matter of being new to the country and having to learn the country. We also looked at different ethnic origins. It's not driven by the prototypical stigmatized groups, which would be the Turkish group in Germany, or Pakistani in England, or Moroccans in Belgium, for instance. It's really something, it's still there when you take out those groups. So then we use a classic decomposition method that is often used to look at ethnic disparities or penalties, so-called penalties on earnings, for instance, or on more economic types of outcomes. And we apply this to belonging. And then you see that when you take into account socioeconomic status of the parents and some social-demographic characteristics, it's only slightly reduced. That's the brown bars. And then in the next step, we take into account individual acculturation. We look at language competence and use. We look at religiosity, and we look at social context, social integration into the mainstream. And you see that it does explain part of the gap, right? So, of course, we all know, I think, that it does explain stuff, but the gap is still there, and it's still significant, even in the third generation. So the fact that the gap is still there is interesting and puzzling, yeah? So that's in line with this disconnect between acculturation, attainment on the one hand, at the individual level, and inclusion or a sense of belonging in society on the other hand. And then just as a snapshot, we have a very recent study in a sociology journal for a change, where we worked with the MyFair data on 10 new immigrant groups in 3 countries, Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. And this is interesting because there we also have the belonging question. How strong would you say is your sense of belonging to people in Denmark, Germany, or the Netherlands? And there you don't just have a Muslim group, but you also have Asian groups, white groups, and also typical human capital migrant groups, like from the US or the UK. And you see that overall, the belonging gap is there. Yeah, so they also feel less national belonging on average, in most cases, across the 3 countries. But what's also interesting is that these gaps vary, not just between countries, but also between origin groups and between origin groups within specific countries. So it's not about race or religion per se. And this suggests that it's about how the boundaries of the national identity or national belonging are negotiated in by specific migrant communities in specific countries. And this is what we are interested in. How are these intercultural relations defined, negotiated within specific contexts of intercultural relations with specific migrant groups in specific countries? So I think there are 2 messages, right? There are these gaps and they vary across context. Third message, when we measure attainment, and we had really fine-grained measures here, otherwise we couldn't publish in that journal. So we have pre and post-migration educational attainment, we have employment status, we have earnings. And when we throw it all in there, it doesn't explain much. Yeah, there are mostly null findings. So it's not because you're succeeding that you're belonging more. Sometimes some aspects of attainment have a positive effect, sometimes even a negative effect. And most of the time, it doesn't have significant effects. But then when you enter into the models, perceptions that your group is being discriminated in the country, you see that this, not always, but when it becomes significant, it's always that pattern, right? So that when new migrants would see that their group is being discriminated in the country, there is no significant, it looks negative, but it's just non-significant. Yeah, so that in this case, they're the Japanese with higher qualifications don't feel more belonging in Denmark. But when they perceive low discrimination or no discrimination, then you see that there is a significant positive correlation, so that those who are more successful also feel more Danish, more belonging. So going from there, I go to the other side of the picture, the social cultural context. So I try to bring in the context to understand how these intercultural relations are defined, so that there can be this disconnect between attainment, acculturation on the one hand and belonging on the other hand. I won't go into much detail because I just want to give you a snapshot of what these contexts could look like. in Europe. So we've done to really deconstruct what are the mechanisms underlying this challenged or weak sense of belonging. We've taken it down recently to not from the national level to the local level of school belonging, because there we have a lot of data on the social networks, on the policies of the schools, the teachers, so we can really look how these intercultural relations are being defined and negotiated within a specific context, and how this then affects possible belonging gaps. So we do find also at the school level that there are on average significant belonging gaps between the minoritized youth, ethnic minority youth, and majority youth attending the school. So that's our starting point. And then we've done a number of studies looking into perceived school climates, actual school policies and teaching practices, and how they define the intercultural relations, and seeing how this then affects unequal belonging, school engagement, and achievement. And there's a number of studies. I won't go into detail, but I just show one example of what could be a relevant policy that probably is familiar in Quebec. In Flanders, we are, in the Flemish part, we are very sensitive about immigrants learning the Dutch language. And so schools have all kinds of rules and policies around language. And some of the policies are more encouraging Dutch, but also a lot of policies are penalizing the use of the mother tongue. And not just for the kids, but also for the parents. And what you see here is just an example of a playground. So it's not about the classroom, where I think teaching is in Dutch, no discussion, but it's about the playground. And it's not talking to the kids, but to the parents who bring the kids to school, saying, in the interest of your child, we speak Dutch here, you too, question mark. So it's a clear injunction. And it's understandable where it comes from, but it can give a message to parents that they're not welcome in the school. And so we're interested in these, like, less obvious effects of the policies on belonging. And this is one example. So we do find when schools penalize the use of the mother tongue outside of the class and teaching context, that this has a significant negative effect on belonging for minoritized youth or students and parents. So this is just one snapshot of a recent study with Gülseli Baescu, where we use the PISA data. It's just because it's big data in many, many countries. And we have the school level and the individual level. And we have a measure in there in 60 countries, which is very reliable and which measures the perception of a discriminatory climate. Like my teacher has misconceptions about the history of some immigrant or ethnic groups, or says negative things about people of those groups, or has low expectations of students from those groups. And when either at the individual level or at the school level, there's more agreement with, or more of a perception that this is, that there is such a climate, we see that it significantly predicts lower achievement on math and reading tests, and that this is mediated through reduced belonging. And interestingly, it works across minoritized and majority students, but ethnic minority students perceive more discrimination. So they have a lower threshold to perceive or to pick up these kinds of discriminatory biases. And so in reality, this means that they do experience less school belonging, and that this does affect their achievement. So I think this is like what we've been doing in many small studies, but on a larger scale. So going from there, what we are currently trying to understand, and that's a bit more shaky still, is this critical meso level of the norms. And we're particularly focusing on the peer networks in the classrooms and when they share certain perceptions of the intercultural relations. And what's interesting about it is that, of course, the context, the policies, the ideologies in the wider environment can define those norms in the peer groups, but not necessarily so. So the peer groups are very diverse, and you do see situated emergent norms or perceptions within the peer group that sometimes challenge these policies or these wider ideologies in the wider environment. So I will show you a bit of that if I have time. Yeah, okay. So we have a first publication accepted in Cultural Diversity and Ethnic Minority Psychology, where we basically establish the phenomenon applied to shared perceptions of discrimination. And our starting point is, when do kids or students, when do they see something as discriminatory? And the idea is that it's not so easy to pick it up because it's very much part of habitual ways of relating, and it's often backed up by justifying ideologies about meritocracy or language deficits, etc. So we were interested in the possibility of shared perceptions of discrimination in these diverse peer groups. And we find first evidence in a study in the US and in the SILS study, also longitudinally, that the peers in the same classroom, which you could see as an interactive group, that when peers in the classroom have a certain perception of discrimination, then over time, this can impact students' own perception of discrimination, controlling for their perception of discrimination at time one. So that there is this preliminary evidence that there is some clustering of the perceptions of discrimination in peer groups, and that there is this longitudinal effects, so that students tend to adjust their own perception of discrimination to those of their peers with whom they interact on a daily basis in class. So that's establishing or like preliminary evidence of a phenomenon. And then what I will present now briefly is what we are trying to do. We are trying to use the network data, the friend nominations, because we suspect that friendship networks are a powerful, social grounding, a powerful way of socially grounding shared perceptions. So I'll skip the expectations then. It's just saying that it's hard to perceive those biases, that we do have evidence that ethnic minority groups within the minority group do share perceptions of discrimination, but we know little about ethnically diverse peer groups. We have mixed findings on friendships. So yeah, basically there's mixed findings. We don't know what happens in these diverse friendship networks in terms of when people align their perceptions of intercultural relations with those of either their minoritized friends or majority friends. So that's what we will be looking at. So we distinguish minoritized friends from majority friends and friendship ties within the same category and across ethnic categories. And we look at all those possible friendship ties in networks of, in 433 networks. And we have minoritized youth of Turkish and Moroccan origin or self-identified Black African, because they are clearly stigmatized and discriminated according to our data. And then we have majority youth native origin. And yeah, so we have about 1,800 of each in these 70 schools and 433 networks. Then we have repeated measures of perceptions of discrimination. This is a very broad measure, so it could be perception on any grounds or unequal treatment on any possible grounds. So that it works for majority as well as for minoritized youth. And we look at individual perceptions repeatedly over time, and we average perceptions over one's nominated ethnic minority friends and nominated majority friends. So this is the questions that we used, the network questions that we used to make, to calculate the friendship ties. So we have ego, and then the dark or gray squares are majority friends, and the white squares are minority friends in the network. And we have boys and girls. So the networks are to some extent ethnically segregated, so that there's much more majority and minority friendships, and there's less cross-ethnic friendships happening. But there are sufficient cross-ethnic friendships to look at those in terms of statistical power. in our data. It's not in all data sets. In some data sets, it's so segregated that it's really hard to study these cross-ethnic types and what they do. So basically, very briefly, when we look within time, we do see that the average perceptions of discrimination of one's minoritized friends do predict significantly one's own perception of discrimination. And this holds true across majority and minority kids and in both groups separately. Then over time, we also find that this significantly predicts, so that here we control for my own perception of discrimination at time 1. So it's whether I change my perception or whether the perceptions change or shift to converge with those my minority friends. And we do see that is significant. Then looking at the majority friends, within time, there's a significant association. But if we replicate it separately for majority and minority students, it's only significant for the majority students, and we cannot replicate it over time. So over time, it's really asymmetric, so that it's the minoritized friends who have minority influence, as we call it, over time. So this is very preliminary, and I want to stop here and say that this is just the beginning of our efforts to understand the integration paradox from the interplay of these minority experiences with norms or shared perceptions within their peer group and the ideologies or the policies in the schools in this way. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That was super interesting. We're going to move on to the Q&A part. Can we act? Oh, yeah. Okay. So people in the room, we're going to pass around the microphone so that people who are online can actually hear your questions. If you are online, you can just type your questions into the chat box, and we're going to read out for you. We're not going to give you your 30 seconds of glory on the screen. So please type your questions or just raise your hand, and we're going to pass around the microphone. It's yours.
Hi again. So it's really interesting work, very ambitious with, looking at all these different levels like macro and meso and the interplay. I'm overwhelmed with like all the information you presented. I was particularly curious about the context, ideologies, because we know in the literature on contact hypothesis that institutions can play a strong role in terms of, orienting the experiences, but also like in the socialization literature that institutions and especially schools have a strong impact on the development of attitudes and behaviors, and that have like long-term impact. And so you mentioned language policies. I was wondering, like, did you look at other types of rules, practices, norms, school climate? I was particularly curious to hear more about your research on that.
Should I respond? Or? Yeah, thank you for this very interesting question. We did look at the school policies more broadly. So we content coded for the 70 schools that were in the SILS data. We content coded their mission statements, because all schools in Flanders need to have a mission statement, a pedagogical mission. And we also content coded their rules. And we content coded them for any reference to culture difference. And we found like 2 dimensions and three dimensions, and one we called color blindness. So that's all the messages that say we don't look at backgrounds, we only look at individual talents and merits and efforts. So that's color blindness, and that's the most frequent. Most messages are colorblind, or you could call it colorblind. That's an American term. It's not exactly the same. It's about religious neutrality. It's about individualism, meritocracy in the Belgian context. So I can give you examples if you're interested. We have a code book. And then the second one is assimilationism, where you actually reject difference and impose the majority normal culture. And that's mostly driven by language and religion. So it's forbidden. The headscarf, like the Muslim signs, are forbidden, but not the Christian signs, for instance. Otherwise, it's neutrality. Yeah, and it's language, of course, as I But that's one factor. And then there's a factor which you could call recognition or multiculturalism, where schools say something about valuing or respecting other cultures, and or about acting against discrimination and racism. And when this is explicitly mentioned, we see that this has a positive effect on, there's a smaller gap in belonging in those schools. But it's less frequent than the colorblind and the assimilationist messages. And it's mostly in the pedagogical mission that you find these statements of respect, whereas then in the rules of the same school, you can find restrictions on expressing identities or cultural differences. So it's a very interesting puzzle, and we didn't expect to find much because schools are so giving such double messages, but apparently, even if, and if there's one message about valuing other cultures or respecting other religions or acting against racism, this is probably very loud, given the general background where this is not mentioned or even rejected. So that's how we understand our findings, and they are published. And then we also have some papers on what teachers communicate, and also on what students perceive, so more the perceived climate, and not just us. There are many colleagues in the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, looking at perceived climate. So I can share what we have.
So there's a question online for you. So the person, not an easy question, I guess, but the person is asking what can be done to facilitate the inclusion of children of immigrants of various ages. So, yes. So it's not an easy one.
Yeah.
Maybe you can think about it if you want to, and I can ask another question.
Yeah, we can come back to it, I guess, also in the following talks.
So I had a question about, well, I have two, but I'll start with the first one. So you do show the deficit, and you associate the integration paradox to the deficit and belonging. And I noticed that at least in some of the studies you emphasize it's a general question of belonging. So how strongly do you belong to the place? In some of the work that I've done with my colleagues, we differentiate between the capacity to identify with the place. So I feel like a Dutch or like a Quebecois, or whether the other one perceives me as being. So do we know that the integration deficit is more salient on just the feeling accepted or recognized, or it's actually on both dimensions of belonging?
Yeah, we didn't ask the question in that way. That's really interesting. I don't know if you find that it's very different. But I could imagine that, like in the quote from the qualitative interview, it's really different because she feels fully German, but she says, I'm not seen like that by the Germans, so it's not socially validated. And I wonder how sustainable it is then for her to feel German if she doesn't feel that it's validated by the real Germans, the eigentliche Deutschen.
I don't want to turn that to our research, but we actually do see differences. So usually the feeling of being accepted is actually much more sensitive to those exclusionary experiences, but there seems to be some sort of resilience in terms of identification. So for instance, the frequency of their discriminatory experiences will have a much stronger impact on their feeling of being accepted, and some impact on identification, but it's like a third of the size of the impact. So there is something happening.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We do have some different measures like ethnic pride versus strength of identification, and also the contents, how they understand the contents of the national identity, like what does it take for me to be a real German? And so there are all kinds of nuances that we can discuss. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Questions? Yeah.
I'm wondering whether you have data or whether you looked at the goals of people who, whether it might be the migrants themselves, it might be the migrants who are the parents of the second generation, and then of course the larger society. So I can imagine a scenario where, the larger society may have a particular position on whether you want the migrants to feel like they belong or not. Under what would belongingness be like for the majority? They might think, well, they might want an arm's length relationship, but that could happen as well in the migrant community, where they say, well, we want our kids to feel like they belong in this domain, but we actually would prefer they belonged with us in this other domain. So it's not necessarily that the ideal trajectory is always maximum belongingness, and then some people maybe
Mm.
for practical reasons fall
Yeah.
short of that. I'm
That's a
curious your
very
thoughts on
interesting
that.
question, and we have looked into it into different kinds of misfit, right? Between generations, between parents and children, but also between majority and minority perspectives on what it means to belong in terms of acculturation, like adopting the mainstream culture. Like, yeah, in the line of Richard Bourris' work on acculturation, where you have these majority expectations. And we're still doing that, actually. We do have a paper on majority expectations of acculturation, which are on average strongly assimilationist, especially when it comes to language, for instance.
Sure.
Yeah, and minorities tend to, especially like parents who want children to maintain, especially religious ties. So there's some room for negotiation, I think, but it's a very interesting question and a very complicated question, because there's different, there's the minority peer group, there's the parental generation, and there's the majority peer group. And it's hard to do well on all sides because of the tensions that you point out, and which are also there in Europe, as you know.
Yeah, and then some domains are easier to blend than others.
Yeah.
So having a bilingual child is one thing. Having a bi-religious child is something else. It's not.
Yeah, religion is not language.
Yeah.
Totally agree. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm just curious about one of the first things that you'd mentioned. It kind of got into it with the spirit of the quote that you'd put up from your interviews, but the minority experience about the integration paradox. And it seems like a large portion of the gap that you were showing is explained by these perceptions of discrimination from our groups. But I'm wondering, what do we know about the mechanism of how that arises in the populations you're dealing with? And so specifically, I wonder if people feel like, so they're doing all this effort and they have the acculturation outcomes showing that they are actually integrated, they're learning values, et cetera. But is it that that's just a social norm that they perceive in society, that they're not, like our group in general, independent of our effort? Or is it that we are working so hard, we don't feel like our contribution is being valued, and therefore we perceive discrimination? So I'm just trying to unpack a little bit, maybe this causal chain that gives rise to discrimination, which then in turn affects feelings of belonging, despite people showing high levels of integration outcomes.
Yeah, that's the question about the different underlying mechanisms. And there's not one answer. There's different possible mechanisms. There's a mechanism that you have higher expectations when you have higher qualifications and so on, and that then these higher expectations are not met. There's also just exposure, because when you're going up the social ladder, you usually come into more white social contexts where you can be more exposed to discrimination, actually. So that, there's actually all these, and there's even like pre-migration qualifications and downward mobility, so that there's different mechanisms, and there's evidence speaking to different mechanisms, actually. And it's a very relevant question that we don't have a definite answer to.
Yes, hello. Thank you for this presentation. That was super interesting. I have a question related to the perceived discrimination. So I understand that you're saying that ethnic minority group do share perception of discrimination, and you are asking, if I understood correctly, whether, like, for the children, those teacher is expecting less from me since I come from another country. So that's the type of perceived discrimination. So I was also wondering, in terms of perceived discrimination of social climate, do you include other dimension? Like, because I was thinking about, between students, because you're talking about the experience, talking with people that already have perceived discrimination, but what about the experience that they have with other students that can be also a form of discrimination? So I just wanted to know more if, can report other types of discrimination that you have seen in your work.
It's very important that the teacher-student context is a very different relational context from the peer context. And we have separate studies on both, but we don't combine them in one study. But we do see also that there are experiences of discrimination at the peer level, like we have looked at ethnic victimization in the classrooms and how it relates to the fit or misfit between kids' own acculturation orientation and the peer norm. So that goes in the direction of peer relations. But here I focused indeed mostly on the teachers and the policies, like more top down, and how this is perceived by the kids. But that's only one aspect. So I totally agree that it's not the same. And it's very important to look at the peer context because it's very influential as well. Maybe less on achievement, but it is influential on belonging, for sure. Yeah.
Hey, so this is I thought this was a really interesting project, and just to contain that really interesting puzzle, this integration paradox, and just to kind of continue on Colin's comment, I wonder if getting at the causal mechanism, maybe this is just something that's been done, and I'm not aware of it because I'm not familiar with the literature, because you're dealing with large and educational data, at least partially with the PISA data, and because social context and, you know, quote unquote, accomplishment and education are so highly endogenous to other things, are there any discontinuities that are possible to exploit looking at this outcome? People that narrowly, I don't know the term used in Europe, but like narrowly were tracked into one academic track versus another. Because I know in Germany, there's they start tracking you, funneling into different paths at an early age. Would it be possible to maybe exploit, you know, some variation or some cutoff in tracking and seeing, well, I'm placed in a more professional context, white collar context, maybe I'm around more, you know, more Germans, I'm in a context where there's less people that are of my ethnic group, I experience more discrimination, or I'm given, you know, a more formal education, given more tools with which to perceive discrimination, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that might be some way to get at the underlying causal mechanism.
Yeah, that's very important. Yeah.
So again, just before you answer, we're going to collect maybe if there are more questions,
yeah.
because we're getting close to the end.
We can talk later.
No, I'm going to give you time, but yeah. Just I want to see if there are more questions. No.
I had another question about experiences of discrimination, and I was wondering if you had looked at different types of discrimination, because I've been working with schools, secondary schools in Quebec, and they talk about like really different experiences when it's majority experiences of discrimination from the majority group or between minority groups. And so have you looked at these different types of experiences, and what are the different impacts on attitudes, integration, and other outcomes?
Final chance? Last chance? No. Okay, then, and I'll ask the last question though, because my director reminded me I had 2 questions. So you most of the studies you presented were on the impact of perceived discrimination, which is a negative treatment, negative experience. Have you looked at the comparative effect of, because most of the time we don't live our lives in like wonderful, welcoming, positive experiences, it's just neutral or indifference. But have you looked at the specific impact of positive experiences? So we're gonna let you have the final words for all of these.
Not the final words, but just a word to the critical transitions in terms of the tracking practices and how this might affect experiences of discrimination. We have a paper on trajectories of discrimination experiences of the kids going through secondary school, which is under review with minor revision. So I'm almost there to share it. And the reviewers did ask the same, like, can you look at the transitions between tracks to see if they explain, for instance, increasing or decreasing experiences of discrimination? Because you're right that in vocational tracks, for instance, you would be less exposed to white majority kids, or the teachers are still anyway. We did look in terms of, does it then explain away or does it fully explain? And it does not, but it's part of the puzzle. And we're looking how we can better model it or specify it so that we can look at it in a more dynamic way. So I'd be very open to your ideas about a narrow approach. And then you asked about different kinds of discrimination between minority kids. We've left that out for now, but it's in the data. So anything with interminority or third groups, we've not yet included it in the analysis, but I'm aware that this is really important because we have like 100 national origins and it's increasingly internally diverse. So yeah, I'd be very interested to hear more about what you find in the Canadian context and how we could try to incorporate it. And then lastly, the positive context, yeah, we have these intergroup friendships, not just in terms of sharing perceptions of discrimination or sharing the bad news, but also in terms of just the positive intercultural experience. And of course, they are hugely important, and especially the lack of them, because the most, I think, if you look at belonging, the strongest predictor is positive context, or in the negative sense, a lack of positive contacts with majority peers or explains less belonging, yeah? Not fully, but it's the strongest predictor, even stronger than language competence. So
we say it's more important to have positive experiences than avoid negative ones.
Both are important, because we also have a paper about the overshadowing effect, that especially not the strong friendship ties, but especially the casual positive contacts, they can be intoxicated by just one negative experience in terms of making people more anxious, for instance, not less eager, but more anxious. And then cumulatively, it is toxic. But I can share it with you. It's an interesting question.
So thank you very much, Karen. We've reached the end of our time. We'll resume in 10 minutes. But before that, we can a good round of applause for Karen. Thank you. So we resume in 10 minutes with Jörg Deumann.